Joël, donc c'est toi qui fais défiler alors, ok?
Sí, sí.
Très bien, merci beaucoup. De nouveau, je ne comprends pas pourquoi ça ne se télécharge pas, mais il n'y avait pas moyen de trouver le fichier. Enfin, bon. L'important, c'est qu'on y arrive.
Bien. Good evening, Professor Patrick, and welcome to our departmental architecture seminar. I'm going to introduce you, and then I will give you the floor to your presentation. At the end, we will allocate a time for questions and answers, and Professor Joel will help us to translate from French to Spanish and vice versa. El profesor Patrick Pigeon es profesor de geografía de tiempo completo de la Universidad de Savoy, Francia. Es investigador en el laboratorio de mediaciones de la Universidad de París-Sorbona. Él es licenciado en geografía, específicamente pues se ha enfocado en la geomorfología estructural. También estudió en la Sorbona la licenciatura y el doctorado en geografía lo hizo en la Universidad de Granada. Él ha estudiado distintas líneas de investigación, entre ellas cómo evaluar las políticas relacionadas con los riesgos, cómo un enfoque geográfico podría ayudar a gestionar los riesgos en estrecha colaboración con las investigaciones de las compañías de seguros, también sobre las discrepancias que existen entre los modelos y la importancia de la retroalimentación de la experiencia después de los desastres, el análisis sistémico de evaluaciones de riesgos y cómo mostrar la complejidad y la incertidumbre en la evaluación y la gestión del riesgo. El día de hoy nos va a presentar una ponencia que lleva por título Contextualizing Data for Improving Risk Related Knowledge in Esmeraldas, Ecuador, que es algo así como contextualizar los datos para mejorar el conocimiento sobre la investigación del riesgo en Esmeraldas, Ecuador. Thank you, Professor.
Many thanks for the translation. Well, first of all, I would like to tell some words in Spanish because I have apologized to have to speak in English. So, me gustaría hablar español con ustedes, pero no puedo hacerlo bien en público como necesitan ahora. Entonces hay que hablar en inglés. Lo siento mucho. Hay que pedir perdón por las molestias. Por supuesto, me voy a hablar en inglés, pero muy despacio. Por favor, se puede preguntar en español si quieren. Gracias. Y lo siento mucho, pero no puedo hablar muy bien en español. Therefore, I will have to turn to English, very unfortunately. As I mentioned in Spanish, also to say Spanish because my Spanish is very rude, I will try to speak very, very slowly. So just in case, don't hesitate to tell me this is too fast and I will try to adapt. Of course, I have to do it. And once again, very sorry for this because I don't have any choice left but to speak in English. And first of all, I would like to thank very warmly the invitation for presenting here some results of research I have made with some of my colleagues. You see on the board, Julien Robotier and Pascal Metzger. They are not here, of course, they cannot attend because they are presently in Ecuador, traveling for work. But, I used to work with them in Ecuador, and therefore we agreed on the possibility of having these results presented by me today. Now, what is the topic on? It's concerned with the city of Esmeraldas. Esmeraldas belongs to Ecuador, as you know, of course. And what is very interesting in that case is that this area experienced a great number of big earthquakes during the 20th century, no less than 5 big earthquakes with a magnitude over 7, which is a very high magnitude. And this is very, very rare. It doesn't fit what we usually find with the Gutenberg-Richter law. That's to say the inverse relationship between magnitude of earthquakes and frequencies of earthquakes. And in spite of this very rare situation, we find here urbanization that still goes on without taking stock of the existing problem related with earthquakes. As you see with the second point on the first slide, we find the Floppet headquarters built in 2015 on a high tsunami risk prone area. Such a situation is not so rare. You might find various similar situations in other parts of the earth. But in that case, it's very interesting to see how this situation came, because it's related with the point I've made before, that's to say a big frequency, high frequency of high magnitude earthquakes, which is unusual. And in order to understand better how this local situation is, I will try to make another point, a relationship with the context. There is a specific context which is related with local cultures, such as a Zomia-like settlement. And Zomia-like settlement has been described by James C. Scott, for example. And those settlements are related with a great divide between institutional cultures and local cultures. In that case, local culture is related with what is being named Zomia type culture and Zambo culture. We will see later what it is related with. And the idea is to understand better the local context and the situation while taking stock of relationship between the local culture and how this type of risk is being managed locally. In order to do this, I propose with my colleagues, we propose four main points. First main point, databases on disasters related with earthquakes in Esmeraldas are very poorly consistent, which is strange because we have a local city in this area, and under such conditions, we should meet more precise, more accurate databases on disasters. On the contrary, with the second point, we will see that increased urbanization does not favor more consistent databases. Why this? Because as urbanization goes on, we find more and more people, more and more building, more and more assets, and therefore information, data, and knowledge on disasters should be made more accurate as time goes on. But such is not the case here. Then we come to the first main question: how can we understand such a challenging situation, such unexpected situation? And in order to understand this, we will come to the third main point, geopolitical conditionings of the information that may help us explain why we find this local situation, which is very disturbing and very disaster prone. Then I will come to the second main question, why disaster prevention still makes sense in spite of this cultural major conditioning, what can be done, and of course, in spite of those very, very big problems related with this cultural divide. And I will come with the fourth point, to a justification from a local field case study, which will show us what can be done, and mostly, more importantly, how should we do something in order to make local people working more in line with local institutions in spite of this big cultural divide. Joël, tu peux passer. Merci. Now I come to the first main point, of course, the general situation and depicting how the situation is locally. You see the general assessment, in spite of major assets related with oil processing, oil transportation, on a highly active Pacific margin in the city of Esmeraldas, we find poorly consistent data on past disasters and on historical earthquakes. In fact, this is very easy to deal with because we find major assets related with the port. Joël, s'il te plaît, est-ce que tu peux montrer où est le port sur l'écran? C'est possible? Ouais, merci beaucoup. The harbor of Esmeraldas, you see, which is related with oil transportation and oil processing here. And we find no less than 5 big plants related with oil transportation and oil processing there. Of course, this is very striking because in this area, we experienced no less than 5 major earthquakes since the 1906 big earthquake with a magnitude which has been given to be over 8, which is very high. And since then, the area experienced no less than 5 more big earthquakes with magnitude over 7. Therefore, this area is extremely earthquake-related risk-prone, extremely dangerous. And even more, the situation is also disturbing because it doesn't fit what we would find according to Gutenberg-Richter law, which normally describe the inverse relationship between magnitude and frequencies of earthquake. Therefore, the situation is absolutely disturbing, be it on the geophysicist side or on the social scientist side, and it's extremely disaster prone. Joël, s'il te plaît, tu peux passer à la suivante, merci. Here we find, of course, what everybody knows for sure, the inverse relationship between the magnitude of the earthquakes, that's to say the energy that is being released when an earthquake occurs. And of course, the frequencies, occurrences of those earthquakes, you see, of course, that there is a statistical law, and generally it works pretty well, but not in the case of Esmeraldas, which is, of course, very unusual. And our colleagues, geophysicist colleagues, try to understand what's happening here, because it's very, very disturbing. So we come to the next slide. You see, of course, we find how the situation is with local assets related with oil transportation and oil processing in order mostly to produce energy for Ecuador as well. In spite of the previous situation described as concerned earthquakes related risk, we find here various plans related with big institutions working at national scale, if not at international scale, with Petroecuador, OCP, Oleoducto de Crudos Pesados, with FLOPEC, Flota Petrolera Ecuatoriana, or with SELEC, which is also a public company. And if you see the map we made with my colleagues, you can see that the situation is Esmeraldas is very unusual once again, very strange. Because you see, for example, the map, we have the airport on the right side of the map, but the airport doesn't attract too much the urbanization of Esmeraldas. On the contrary, the present urbanization is being attracted by the plants that are related with oil transportation and refineries as well. And of course, this situation even more increases the trend towards having a disaster being prepared in Esmeraldas, which is very striking. Once again, it's very unusual, even though your colleague in Mexico, who made a PhD on Coatzacoalcos, for example, had something quite similar when she defended as a PhD. Of course, you see, there might be some crisscrossing with situations that also exist elsewhere. But the situation here is especially tensed, especially provocative and disrupting. And in spite, est-ce que tu peux passer la diapositive suivante, s'il te plaît? Merci. In spite of this very provocative and disrupting situation, you see, the problem is also related with the poor quality, the very poor quality of the information we have today, be it on the geophysicist side or be it on the historical side, social scientist side. You see the map we have on the right part of the slide here. The map is very strange because it delivers an information that is totally unexpected. As you may know, in Equator, the land is distributed within the Sierra and the Costa. On the Sierra, we find information which is historical and dates back to 18th century, and even in some cases to the 17th century. This information is displayed in blue or in red, okay? But as you see, on the contrary, when we come to the coastal area where, of course, we find Esmeraldas, then we have nothing but information dating back to the beginning of the 20th century, which is absolutely unexpected once again, because considering the Pacific type of this continental margin, of course, we expect to have big earthquakes and also disasters on the coastal area, but the information delivered doesn't fit what we should find. You see, there's a big discrepancy between what we expect to find with historical information and what we have. So, of course, how can we understand this in spite of the big assets we have, in spite of the disaster-prone area, which is related more and more with high stakes at national levels and international level, we still find today an information which is very poor and not very consistent. So what can we do with all this? And how to understand this situation, which is also very surprising and disruptive? And it doesn't come from the historical information as such, or come from the quality, supposed quality of geophysicists and how they work. Because should we rely on other sources, such as with Espinosa Apollo, Historia de los terremotos y las erupciones volcánicas en el Ecuador. In that case, we can also check that even the big earthquake, which dates back to 1906, has even not been reported on this historical source, which covers the history of Ecuador, which is absolutely striking. Therefore, the question is, what can we do with such very poor information, and how can we use it, and how can we understand such a challenging situation? Because, of course, we have to move ahead, and then we come to the next slide, which pertains to the databases we have here. Tu peux passer la diapositive suivante. Merci beaucoup, Joël. You say, should we come to other sources, and we made the job in Esmeraldas, of course, and in Quito as well, then we can check the fact that we are bound to find other earthquakes, ancient earthquakes, but those earthquakes are not pretty well located, and the information concerning those earthquakes is very fuzzy, as soon as we have events that are supposed to date back to the 19th century. For example, according to Molina Serrano, here, we found an information, but this information is so fuzzy, so unstable, so poor, that geophysicist colleagues did not use it, considering that it's not relevant enough. Therefore, under such conditions, we are bound to find what we find with the next slide. la diapositive suivante, s'il te plaît, Joël. Okay, which is on databases, because we crisscross information coming from various databases on disasters. In that case, no less than 4 databases, sources. That to say, databases coming from geophysicists, the first part of it, and information coming from Desinventar. Of course, I suppose you have heard of Desinventar because it comes from Latin American country. They decided, LADED decided to produce another type of database on disasters while compensating for the problems that we meet with MDAT. You see, MDAT, Emergency Database for Equator. And we have also local database, that has been pushed forward by Dercol and Serrano here. And of course, what you can see, I hope you see it very plain, is that whatever the database, the information of the database varies. Of course, this is very poorly consistent, and the information is still very fuzzy, even though this information dates back to the 20th century and not for the period more ancient than the 20th century. Therefore, once again, we find a situation very, very strange. And of course, we come back to the same basic question, the same basic issue. Why do we find such fuzzy, such rare, such unprecise, such poor information on earthquakes-related disasters, whereas we have such big assets related with oil transportation and also a city, the city of Esmeraldas, with people living here, over 2,100 people. And considering the point, we can move to the next slide. Joël, s'il te plaît. Merci. Then we come back to the main questions. You see, 2 major issues to be considered in the face of such poorly consistent databases and information. How to explain the increase of the disasters the urban agglomeration of Esmeraldas experienced, with a first answer, which is almost obvious, but as we will see, the situation is not as easy as that. The obviousness cannot be checked, and in fact, urbanization cannot help to explain as such the situation we find today. This is not because we have more and more people, more and more building, more and more assets in the city of Esmeraldas that we experience more and more disasters here. And therefore, the understanding has to be found elsewhere. And elsewhere, that means turning to conditionings of information in that case. And the second point, how to explain the increase of frequencies concerning earthquakes with magnitude exceeding 7 after the 1906 earthquake. And this question is closely related with the other one, because of course it pushes us towards testing the relevance of the historical information we have with disasters on this specific type margin. You see, I mentioned, but in red, in bold letters, both issues are closely linked. And this is why, in that case, we, Julien, Pascal, and me are working very closely with geophysicist colleagues who also work on this area of Latin American countries. Therefore, I hope that the situation has been made the clearest way possible. You see, the issue is very important on ethical aspects, on economical aspects, and it turns around the situation, very strange situation we have here. Therefore, how to understand this? The first answer to this question may look obvious, and it helps us going to the second main point of the presentation, which is related with relationships existing between urbanization in Esmeraldas and of course the big number of disasters we have here. Therefore, we come to the second main point. Joël, s'il te plaît. Merci. Et après, you see, increased urbanization does not favor more consistent databases in spite of what we should find. Because logically, as soon as we have more and more people settling on a place, with more and more building, more and more economic... Sorry. Joël, vous m'entendez? Joël, tu m'entends?
Si, continue.
Ok, parce qu'il y a eu un bruit. ¿Se puede que hay una pregunta, por favor? Dícenmelo.
On les fait après les questions.
Ah, ok. Disculpe. So, I come back to the presentation. En caso que hablo muy rápido, por favor, dícenmelo, hay que adaptar. You see, it's very difficult for me to speak in public. Of course, I had the opportunity to travel to Latin American country, but both my colleagues speak very well Spanish, which is, of course, not the case for me. And I worked on these issues while working on the archives also, and because I'm more on the geophysicist side of this this issue, and this is why we work together. You see, I'm the less social scientist of the team, if I may say so. So I come back to the second main point, and maybe it would be better for me to slower the speed of the speech as well. Sorry, because from time to time, I try to gain time, and it's not a good idea. You say we have a scheme here, and the scheme try to depict the general situation we have as it concerns relationship between urbanization in Esmeraldas. You have demographic growth. You see the number of inhabitants in Esmeraldas on the left side of the scheme, and also are being spotted various big earthquakes I mentioned before, the 1906 earthquake, the 1942, 1958, and 1979, and lastly, last but not least, the 2016 earthquake that occurred in Esmeraldas. And of course, considering the scheme, we may be induced to think that the problem is not a problem, because as soon as we have more and more people settling there, we are bound to have more and more earthquake. Okay, so it's plain, it's obvious, and where is the problem? And while trying to make even more the point, we can refer to the scheme Mosquera, produced in 1959, and Mosquera mentioned the big destruction Esmeraldas experienced in the area which is named Barrio de las Palmas, and he mentioned that the area has been totally destroyed during the earthquake, and the conclusion of the author is as follows, very classical, but why do those people build here? Because this area is so much earthquake risk prone, you see? So it may be very obvious, but whatever the obviousness, in reality, it doesn't work so well. And this is why we come to the second slide. Joël, s'il te plaît, la diapositive d'après. Ça semble être coincé. Tu arrives. Merci beaucoup. And on the next slide, this time we have means. This is specifically the slide I made and we worked on with Julien Robotier with a common publication in 2019. And what is the value of the scheme, you see? It considers three of the biggest earthquakes we have in Esmeraldas. The earthquakes in 1906, 1942 and 1979, and we crisscross the information, very basic information, with the demographic growth. Because in 1906, we were told that, of course, there wasn't any good information on the disaster and also on the earthquake, because there were almost nobody living here. You see on the left side, we have the number of inhabitants, and there were, let's to say, well, 2,000 or 3,000 people living here, which is very poor, of course, very poor people and low people, and very poor number of people. But in reality, when we check the information we have on Esmeraldas at this time, and we did this very accurately, we found an information which was very different, because in spite of having a limited amount of people living here, we found various buildings, institutional buildings, that proved that there still were there buildings at stakes, and those buildings should have been impacted by the earthquakes when it occurred. Such is the case with School Juan Montalvo, which has been pictured here in 1905, 1 year before the big 1906 earthquake, which is considered by geophysicists to be among the higher magnitude earthquakes ever experienced at the whole Earth. Of course, it's one of the biggest earthquakes we have experienced at the surface of the Earth. And even more, during this earthquake, there also was a tsunami, and the tsunami should have destroyed as well various buildings. And of course, the problem is why this information is very rare, very fuzzy, and not very easily to be found. On the contrary, you see, in 1942, then there was another earthquake with magnitude 7.7, no tsunami. And in that case, of course, on the contrary, what I found while working on the archives at Quito, which is, of course, is the capital city of Ecuador, is a big amount, this time, of information concerning damages related with this earthquake. You see, the situation is very strange, because the magnitude was lower than the magnitude measured in 1906. The number of people was not so big, as you may see directly on the demographic growth here, population growth. However, the information available is by far higher, which is very surprising. It means very simply that there is no simple relationship, direct linear relationship between earthquake and damages delivered, and this is clearly depicted by the information discrepancies we have between both events. And lastly, we put forward as well the 1979 earthquake. Why this? Because this earthquake has a magnitude measured over 8. Also, it's one of the biggest earthquakes this area has ever experienced. At that time, the number of people living there was higher than what happened in 1942. And also there was a tsunami. A tsunami came to the shore and should have destroyed as well buildings and killed people. But in spite of this situation, we have very limited information available in El Comercio, which is the national newspaper existing in Ecuador. You see, once again, the discrepancy between the information available, the magnitude of the earthquakes, and the existing disasters. And once again, we have to consider again the point, because urbanization is not sufficient enough for explaining the information we have on existing disasters concerning this Pacific type margin. Why do we find such a challenging situation here? Once again, you see, it's not obvious at all, and we should come to another point, which is related to how the information is being framed, who makes the information, how the information is being proceeded, and so on. And this is why I come to the next slide with you, which is very simple, how to explain such an expected situation. And of course, it comes to the fact that social scientists are supposed to work as well with geophysicists on those issues. And therefore, I come with you, I hope so, to the third main point. Joël, s'il te plaît, donc la troisième partie. Thank you so much. Seen from social sciences, risk related with earthquake needs to be contextualized. What does contextualize mean? It's absolutely necessary to take under consideration how the information is being framed, who frames the information, who delivers the information, and what the information is being made for. What is the goal behind this information? And in that case, we find a very, very important point, which is related with the big cultural divide we have between institutions, official institutions, of course, that are related with Equator State, for example, and the local situation, which is related with local culture and population that are considered to be very specific. They are named Zambos. Zambo is a name depicting people who came from Indian and ancient slaves, black slaves fleeing from the colonization and fleeing from the national state of Ecuador. And in that case, we have a strong divide, a big cultural divide, because those people try to oppose decisions coming from the national state of Ecuador, and this during the history until today. And under such situation, we find a Zomia type situation. You can perhaps see on the book cover of James C. Scott, the art of not being governed, the art of not being governed, how those people try to oppose the control coming from the Equatorian state, with the colony states, Spanish in that time, and other metropolis around the world. In order to make this point clearer, because it's not so much usual, I propose to come to the next slide, which is the 16. Joël, s'il te plaît. Merci. Thank you so much. On this slide, we can see directly on the field how a Zomia type settlement looks like. You see, I took the picture A from the building that accommodates the province of Esmeraldas. And this building is the highest of the building we have today in Esmeraldas city. But what is interesting here is that we have here a cathedral. Maybe, Joël, est-ce que tu peux montrer la cathédrale, donc, s'il te plaît? Sur la diapositive, la A. Merci. Exactement. The cathedral is here, you see. It's a building made of concrete here, right behind the park, you see. But what is very striking is that we hardly see this cathedral, which is very strange because it's, of course, Latin American country. Let's consider the situation you have in Mexico. In Mexico City, the cathedral can be seen from far away. You see, it's one of the biggest building, even though you have La Torre Latinoamericana, which is, of course, higher, and the buildings in Reforma. But the general cathedral, of course, can be plainly seen. In that case, such is not the situation. And should we come nearer to the entrance of the building here, you can see that we have grids. the entrance is not as easy as that. You can go in freely into the building. And inside the building, you have also grids, once again, protecting this big painting. And the painting is the only painting we have inside the cathedral itself, the central cathedral. And as you see, the painting is on evangelization. You see, you have a priest and maybe an ancient slave. We do not know exactly who he is, this child, but he represents Zambo, a part of local population. Therefore, you see, religion, Catholicism, well, has to be protected in Esmeraldas, you see, and it is related with a way of controlling people, of managing people, and local people still oppose this power, as can be made clear, at least I hope so, when we turn to official buildings such as this one. On the contrary, should you see what we have on the right side of the picture, we have a public space here, a public place, and on this public place we have a monument, and the monument depicts what is being named marimba. Marimba in Ecuador is related with a local dance, related with local music, and both are strongly related with Zambo-like cultures, local cultures. And in that case, you can see that this monument doesn't need to be protected by grids. It's open, and of course, it's preserved as such. And it's also in strong relationship with local representation of local cultures. Therefore, we find once again the great cultural divide between Zomia types of settlement, local cultures that try to oppose powers or well, means of controlling local population. And it may look very, very far from the situation which are related with risk management, but in fact, not that much. Let's go, please, to the next slide. On the next slide, merci, Joël. On the next slide, we find back once again the great cultural divide and the great cultural and power divide. On the left and upper part of the slide, we find Julien Robotier with the orange jacket here, and Pascal Metzger, who is taking a picture, and I took myself the picture. This is why I'm not on the picture myself, of course. And in that case, we were working with representatives of local institutions related with oil processing and power production in Esmeraldas. We were looking downwards in the direction you have on the second picture on the center of the slide, where you find the Rio Taone Valley. Ouais, merci donc de montrer, tu vois, c'est la photo qui est juste au-dessus. Merci. That's it. This is the right picture here. River Taone, and you see the chimneys of those buildings, the same as the chimneys that are related with Selec power plant here. And this situation is as if local institution, national institution were considering local people from a top-down approach, you see, trying to understand how the situation is related with technological and so-called natural risk, because these areas are related with flood risk and tsunami risk, therefore related with earthquakes, once again. And on the contrary, you see on the right part and bottom part of the picture, you have another picture I took myself. And on this picture, you find local population living in Baguio which has been named Barrio 50 Casas. Of course, Barrio 50 Casas is informal settlement. Very poor people live there. They try to survive in this area, and they are considering the upper part of the hillside as if they were looking towards, you see, the people, considering them from, well, the upper part of the hillside. And the idea is that those people should work together, but in reality, they don't work together. They don't speak together. And we find here the great cultural divide once again. The engineers that you have on this part of the picture usually live in Quito, and they take the plane in order to work in Esmeraldas. For them, living in Esmeraldas is as if it were some kind of nightmare. They fear living there. And of course, local people find this situation very, very difficult. Therefore, I come to the next slide, the 18th slide, because in that case, we find clear proofs, I hope so, proofs of the discrepancies between institutions and local population. Because in the case of local documents trying to manage how risks are, we find here official document coming from le PDOT, Plan de Desarrollo y de Ordenamiento Territorial de Esmeraldas. And the local plan tried to depict how local risks are being managed. We find in pink the official representation of the urban area of Esmeraldas. Joël, excuse-moi, tu peux montrer donc le rose sur la carte? Merci. Here in pink. But you see, this official document is not accurate enough because it doesn't take under consideration what is related with the Barrio 50 Casas. You see the red arrow. The red arrow depicts where the barrio is, and you can plainly see here that the barrio is not taken under consideration by the official document. Why this? Because for the institution trying to manage risk, the people living here are considered to be dangerous, to be a risk factor, and it's easier not to take them under consideration. It's exactly some kind of top-down way of considering local people and trying to get rid of them, even though they are still on the field, of course. So I come to the last point. Under this condition, this great cultural divide between local institutions, national institutions, and local population, what can be done in order to improve risk management? And how is it relevant to try to do something to improve how the local situation is? In order to try to make the point, I come to the fourth main point and the last main point. It's the slide 20. Thank you, Joël. Thank you. This is justification from a local field case study, risk cultural fragmentation as preparing a disaster with Barrio 50 Casas. And this time we are proceeding at the local scale while trying to make clear and clearer, maybe, why the great cultural divide between institutions and local people is so much relevant when trying to manage disasters and prevent disasters in that case. Here we are on the embankments of Rio Teone, we have seen a moment before, and we can see that the embankments of Rio Teone are not managed equally. On this side, which is on the left side of the Rio, we find gabions that reinforce, strengthen the embankment and try to reduce flood risk when floods occur, right? But on the right side, just before here, just on the first plan, we find the right side of the embankment. And on this side, we don't find any gabion working. This, of course, induces us to think that this area is more flood prone and more tsunami prone than the embankment that bears the Select plant. The Select plant is related with oil processing and oil processing for producing power for Esmeraldas and a part of Ecuador. And of course, I would like also to draw attention on the yellow ribbon you have here. You also have the text at the bottom of the slide. You have the yellow ribbon. Why this? Because the ribbon tries to protect cooling devices from being obstructed by garbaging floating on the Rio. Of course, the plant has to be cooled down. And in order to cool down the engines, it's necessary to have water. And this is also why the Select plant has been located very close to the Rio. And of course, the yellow ribbon here, you see, tries to prevent the plant to be disrupted in case of the engines could not be cooled down while using the water pumped from the Rio. But why do we have such problems coming with floating garbage? In order to do this, I propose to come to the next slide. Joël, s'il te plaît. Indeed, the next slide proves the fact that during the 2016 floods, the Select embankment has not been flooded, whereas the embankment bearing the Barrio 50 Casas has been flooded. And the pictures prove as well the discrepancy of flood situation between both embankments. And under those conditions, it's very necessary to understand why those floating garbages are considered to be a threat to the plant. This coming from the institutional side, people that manage the plant. Therefore, we come to almost the last slide, the slide 22, Joël, excuse-moi. Merci. And in order to understand why the floating garbage can be a problem for institutions in charge of the Select plant, we come back to the local population, because those local population try to gain ground at the expense of the Rio while using garbage, solid waste, because of course solid waste is not being processed and is not being managed at the local scale. Let's keep in mind the fact that it's informal settlement here. Therefore, local people try to gain ground at the expense of Rio Terone, and the Rio Terone flows, of course, and flushes the garbage, and this garbage streams and is also a threat, as previously mentioned, for the plant that is directly downstreams. Therefore, we see that even though what's the general things to be considered, even though institutions do not speak with local population, institutions in charge of Select and risk related with the plants, in reality interact with, of course, local people, and those interactions tend to prepare future disasters that are related with various types of risk, be they related with earthquakes, be they related with floods, be they related with, of course, tsunamis, or be they related with technical risk as well. These various types of risk are interconnected, and of course, the great cultural divides needs to be reconsidered in order to improve how those types of risk are being managed here. And lastly, I come to almost the last slide, the 23. Because here we can find that in spite of having official documents coming from the municipality of Esmeraldas, you see, in spite of having official documents depicting where flood risk and tsunami risk are, we still find strong discrepancies between this official representation and how people settled or not on this flood and tsunami prone areas. For example, here we have Barrio 50 Casas on a flood and tsunami prone area. Okay, in spite of having the information depicted, people are still living here. And as we have seen, the area is strongly related with institutions in charge of national, if not international, assets here. But people are still here. And on the contrary, we find new informal buildings, very freshly erected, freshly built in this area, which is not being depicted as flood prone, even though it's very clear directly on the spot that those areas are highly flood risk and tsunami prone, risk prone, but of course the information is not very consistent. So the big question is, what are these maps being made for? And they address other types of risk related with other types of conditions local settlements try to manage. Once again, it's always the same question. When we try to work on flood, earthquakes related risk, we never work on flood risk and or nor on earthquakes related risk. It's a wide array of risk, and the way this wide array of risk is being managed needs to take under consideration how the information is being contextualized. Therefore, I come, even though I came a moment before on this, on the last slide, you say some points that could be discussed together, should you like the idea, of course, some outcomes to be discussed. First of all, the first point, I like this very much because, this issue is very close to the points my colleague geophysicists try to make. You see, poorly consistent databases and information lacking don't need, doesn't mean that we don't have the absence of proof. The absence of proof is not a proof of the absence. This is not because you don't have reliable information, because you don't have information that a disaster did not exist, nor that an earthquake did not exist. The absence of information does not prove the absence of a disaster, nor doesn't prove the absence of an earthquake, which is very important for geophysicists, because before the instrumentation came at the very beginning of the 20th century, of course, geophysicists don't have other possibilities but to turn to historical records. And in that case, because of the local context, historical records are very poor and not very reliable. You see, the absence of proof is not the proof of the absence. So what to do in order to compensate for such a situation, which is very uncanny. Second, existing data and information are highly conditioned by the geopolitical situation of Esmeraldas. Of course, there is the big cultural divide. I tried to make plain, but there is also other elements I don't have time enough to present. For example, the situation of the province of Esmeraldas, very close to the border between Colombia and Ecuador, which means drugs, illegal, illicit trades of weapons and so on. And under such conditions, of course, the information is being made very rare and being made very fuzzy. It's, of course, a means of opposing the control of the national state on and international states on those traffics. Third point, of course, under those conditions, there is a place for discussing a historically hidden major disaster related with an earthquake before the 20th century, as I tried to defend during this presentation, which is very relevant as well as for geophysicists, but as well as for social scientists as me, trying to prepare the next disaster, trying to reduce the amount of damages that we are bound to find when the next disaster will happen. And lastly, of course, the last point, sorry for being that long, disaster prevention policies should integrate context framing data in order to improve governance. The point is, it's absolutely not possible to directly use the existing information because the existing information has been transformed, processed, and it has been specifically processed here, taking under consideration the local context, a ZOMIA type local context, which is very specific. So sorry for being so long. I'm almost at the end of this presentation. Sorry for the English once again. I would prefer to say sorry for the Globish because I don't speak like your neighbors, Gringolandia, but I'm not speaking as well as English people do. So it's Globish. Maybe it's also easier for us to communicate in English. And of course, I will try to answer any question you may have, as I mentioned before with my poor Spanish, because as I mentioned, I'm not in a position to speak with us in Spanish presently. Maybe on a basic situation, okay, but not in an academic forum, it doesn't fit.
Thank you, Professor Patrick. Merci. Now we will have some time for questions and answers or comments. Remember that you can ask the questions in Spanish and the answers will be translated. Okay. Entonces se pueden hacer las preguntas en español y pues las podemos traducir. Bueno, yo no. Adelante. Adelante, Dr. Milton.
Gracias, doctora Olivia. Thank you, Dr. Patrick, for your presentation. It was very clear and very interesting what you presented today.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias.
And I think that your presentation demonstrates once again that understanding disaster risks requires not just a naturalistic approach or a physical approach, but again, it's necessary to take a look at the historical, cultural, social conditions that frame or that shape disaster risk in time. And I got two points that for me were very clear in your presentation. The first one is the importance of taking these factors into account to understand risk. And the second one, that in the absence of information about current risks, it seems to be that in this territory, the issue of uncertainty is quite big or quite important, because this region, the probability is not a wish, but it seems to be that there is a very high probability of a major earthquake in the next years. And my question is, what is the political position in front of this uncertainty, but at the same time, this still confronting positions between the Somia population and the political position? What is the political discourse that in which direction goes this political discourse?
Yes. Thank you so much for your considerations. It's not really a question, but a discussion between us. Well, considering the official position, we had the opportunity to work on this part of Ecuador, which at first time was not so much obvious. When we declared that we would like to work on Esmeraldas, Ecuadorian colleagues told us that it would be for nothing, because we would be expected to find nothing interesting, and it won't be possible to work here, to tell the truth, because of the information very fuzzy and so on. And in spite of this situation, we decided with Pascal and Julien to move to Esmeraldas. We made various journeys there, you see, and we discussed with the municipality, with the local population, with the institutions working there, as I mentioned, SELEC and so on. And the positions were as follows. For the municipality still complains a lot on the poor transfer of funds coming from the institutions in charge of oil processing and power production. So they are always complaining on this, and they call even more for having more compensation coming from this institution. This is the official position coming from the institution in charge of oil processing and so on. And the second position, very interesting, I would like to mention, is that those institutions working at the national, if not international level, would like very much to reconsider how they give money to local population, because in reality there are fund transfers between institutions and local population, because those institutions found that money was used in order to... I'm sorry, disculpe. Maybe there is another question, but I would like to finish up with the answer, if you don't mind. So I was about to tell you that the transfer of funds from the local, national and international institutions, SELEX, Petro-Ecuador, FLOPEC, and so on, OCP, and so on, towards the local population was increasing the risk for the populations and the risk for the institutions that are in charge of the oil transfer and the oil processing. So it's exactly the situation I tried to make clear with the fourth point. Do you remember it? You see the interactions between how local population are processing solid waste and how this way of processing solid waste tries to increase risk for SELEC and national institutions. Because at the very same time, SELEC gives money in order to improve schools in Barrio 50 Casas, Inversiones. And of course, this is beneficial for the local population, but at the very same time, it increases flood risk, if not tsunami risk, and increase also as feedback risk for SELEC and national institutions in charge of oil processing and so on. So you see, your question is very, very interesting and very, very relevant. Thank you very much for this, because it should lead us to take under consideration various aspects of how local actors and national actors try to work together, even though they do not really work together. It's very weak, very poorly consistent, because in the end, this transfer funding tends to increase risk for local population and for national, if not international, institutions as well. This is why we had with my colleagues the opportunity to work very well with those national institutions. I would even dare to say that should we have to work in France on similar issues, it wouldn't have been that easy. It's under those conditions easier for us to work in Ecuador than working on similar issues in France. So in the end, the last word, sorry, I promise, the last word is that the issue of disaster prevention is being considered very, very seriously, but at the very same time with the problem, major problem, what to do with the great cultural divide.
I have just another question, very, very, very quick. In the absence of information, of official information or geographical information, have you considered oral narratives from the local population? I remember that you were here in 2012 in a project with Dr. in the CSAS, Virginia Garcia Costas.
Yes, of course, yes.
And they have been, of course, and they have been trying to document historical data from disasters from all historical documentaries. And so, have you ever considered to take into account oral narratives or what the people remember by themselves to achieve this database?
Yes, of course, this is what we try to do because you see, as I mentioned, the historical archives are very poor. The great divide is also between the Sierra and the Costa. In the Sierra, you have pretty good historical information, even though, of course, there are still limitations behind the information. But on the contrary, in the Costa, the information is very rare. And this is also related with how the information is being processed. For example, just one point. In 1958, the major in charge in Esmeraldas decided to burn local archives because they were, well, considered as turning to be dangerous, you see, because of mushrooms and things like that. You see, the local historical information has been burned down by the local mayor. That gives very good information on how historical information is being treated. And at the very same time, it gives very good information on the poor means that are related with the conservation of these types of information. Because at the very same time, when we came to San Mateo is a part of Esmeraldas city that is supposed to have been related with conquistadores, you see, at the beginning of 16th century, similar as Cortés in Mexico, for example. And San Mateo was at the very beginning of Esmeraldas. And when we came to the spot, we didn't find any clue, any proof of having seen conquistadores here. But when we asked the question to local population, everybody told us, of course, this is the place where conquistadores landed, but we know that, but it's not written down because it's plain to us, you see? So there is local culture type, which is zomia, not written type of culture. And this is, of course, one of the solutions we may find locally. You see, once again, the absence of written proof is not a proof enough of the absence of information. And this is one of the most important points, I think, that should be considered, but it's being considered by anthropologists, for example, and Virginia Garcia Costa made a similar work, even though she tried to rely on Codex in Mexico, which is, of course, written in that case, but not, of course, Spanish written, of course.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patrick.
Thank you, Dr. Patrick and Dr. Milton. Monica has a question. She says, we have a question, more than a question. I would like to make a comment. A few years ago, I was in Ecuador, in Guayaquil, and indeed, I believe that it lacks information of possible disasters. I did not experience earthquakes locally, but I did experience floods since the infrastructure of Guayaquil has not correct, and it was surrounded by a large river. I share the professor's vision on the importance of preventive information for disaster in architecture. It's a comment.
Okay.
Thank you, Monica. And Dr. Joel?
Thank you for,
Sí.
thank you for the comment, which is interesting as well. So, but you see, there's plenty of things to be discussed on. the subject, the topic is extremely attractive, even though it's extremely difficult at the very same time to be handled, and especially at the local scale, locally.
Thank you. Dr. Joel?
Sí, sí voy a hacer la pregunta en español, después te tradujo. Tengo la impresión que este misterio de por qué no hay información antes de 1906, yo creo que habrá que ver cómo era el hábitat allá en esta época. Porque yo he ido una vez en Esmeraldas y yo me acuerdo de las viviendas, eran viviendas de madera sobre pilotes con techo de guano. Y supongo que en esta época, al final del siglo XIX, no había poca población seguramente, pero si había un sismo no pasaba nada. O sea, si estás en una casa sobre pilote, que es sobre todo para evitar, bueno, para sobrevivir con las inundaciones, un sismo no te va a afectar. Si tu as compris la question.
Tout à fait, tout à fait. But I can I have an answer because we considered the point, as you can imagine, and we compared the situation existing in 1906 between Tumaco. Tumaco is in the southern part of Colombia, and Esmeraldas. And the situation is considered to be very similar. Even today, the situations are really very similar. In Tumaco, there was madera, and the building made of wood. And in spite of this very close situation between Tumaco and Esmeraldas, in Tumaco in 1906, the earthquake has been experienced as well. And there were big damages reported, but not in Esmeraldas. And of course, you see, the explanation related with how buildings are made or conceived is very interesting. Once again, it's a factor. It may help to understand why so little damages have been experienced in Esmeraldas in 1906, but it's not sufficient enough, even though the Zomia understanding of the situation is not sufficient enough as well, because Tumaco belongs also to a Zomia type settlement. you see, and in spite of being a Zomia type settlement, we have more damages reported in Tumaco in 1906 and as well in 1979, because I also made the work while comparing how the situation were in Tumaco and in Esmeraldas when the 1979 earthquake came. And exactly the same. We did not have a lot of damages reported for Esmeraldas in El Comercio, but also in La Hora de Esmeraldas, which is the local newspaper. Even the same case for El Universo, which is the newspaper in Guayaquil. But on the contrary, when I tried to find information on the southern part of Colombia, I found a lot of information. Once again, even though the settlements are supposed to be very close. You see, there's something strange about Esmeraldas. It's very difficult to grasp, but really there is a problem with how the local information is being proceeded and kept or not. But really there is some kind of gap, and by chance, or not chance, this gap also exists when it comes to the geophysicist way of considering the problem, because for geophysicists, they don't understand what's happening in Esmeraldas as well. But in that case, of course, we are sure that Esmeraldas experienced no less than 5 big earthquakes. So it's not a question of cultural conditioning or so, because those earthquakes have been measured, for sure. But you see, whatever the part of the issue, there's still something amiss with Esmeraldas. Difficult to grasp, difficult to understand, and the local population looks to be very proud of that. who are different, you see, who are opposing. And the nickname of Esmeraldas province is the rebel province. We oppose. We do not like the church. We do not like Spanish. We do not like Quito. We do not like Guayaquil as well. We are Zambos. And therefore, we do what we wish to do. You see, I come back to the title of the book on Zomia, The Art of Being a Rebel. Not to be governed, in fact, being governed, but by ourselves with our rules and not relying too much on the classical way of considering things, the metropolitan way of considering things. So it's a very strange area, but we are under the way of ending up the Atlas of Esmeraldas with Pascal and Julien, of course, and it will be in Spanish in that case. Of course, I won't be writing down this part in Spanish, as you can imagine, but I will be on the boat as well.
Sí, ¿cuándo empezó lo del petróleo en Esmeraldas? Porque tal vez es a partir de ahí que les interesaban, porque los sismos afectan los productos.
70s. 1970s. This is why the earthquake in 1979 is very important, because in spite of having Balao is the name of the terminal of oil processing. Balao existed at the end of the 1970s, but in spite of having Balao existing, we don't find information concerning the tsunami that existed at that time, even though that tsunami came by low tide. And of course, it's very important because low tide and high tide, it makes a difference. Okay, but you see, once again, this is unexpected. We should have information on damages related with Balao, and still we don't have. And when we asked the information to OCP, Petroecuador, and so on, they told us, no, sorry, we don't have information on that. And on the other side, they offered the possibility to consult the local archives, and this we did, and that was very interesting, considering inversiones, which were very important for them, of course, because this issue is considered to be a clue issue for those institutions working there.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you, Dr. Patrick and Dr. Joel. Adrian has a question. Good afternoon, excellent presentation. I would like to know about Ciudad Esmeraldas and the story on this area. It is possible to prevent future earthquakes or other similar situations, or to make a protocol for dangerous situations?
Well, it's a difficult question, this one. But you see, I would like to answer like this to this very interesting and challenging question, because whatever the place, whatever the situation, once again, when it comes to earthquake or flood or landslide related risk, you are bound to work on other risk types that are not taken under consideration at first sight, because it's impossible to consider a risk related with hazard only as if people were working or living according to this only. In fact, it's extremely simple, basically. But the way we try to understand and the way we try to manage push us forward, having, you see, a compartmentalized way, a fragmented way of considering things. Therefore, it's some kind of trap, because when we try to understand things, we come to analysis. The analysis disrupts things and induces us to consider things as if they were totally separate. But in reality, they are not separate at all. This is why it's absolutely necessary to come to a recombination of those elements that are related with risk. And in that case, I'm very fond of a systemic analysis types because, of course, it helps trying to go that way, you see. But once again, in order to understand the question, I would like to attract the attention on the fact that it's not possible to understand how to manage one type of risk, whatever the country, whatever the context, whatever the situation. This is something you may observe whatever the situation is.
Thank you.
But at the very same time, the context is still very important.
Okay, thank you, Adrián and Dr. Patrick. Dr. Raimundo Mayorga says, Dr. Pigeon, excellent lecture. Thanks for
sharing
so much.
I'm about to be very confused, but that's very nice from you. Muchas gracias por las respuestas.
Gracias. Dr. Miguel Chargoy has a question. Good afternoon. It is a very interesting topic about disasters due to earthquakes. In this presentation, there is a slide where we saw a graph of the frequency of earthquakes. The question is, it has been studied why the number of earthquakes has increased exponentially, especially since 1950 in the Emerald Zone. Thanks to be in touch with us.
Well, what I would like to offer in that case is that the Mexican colleague would communicate with my geophysicist colleagues on this, because of course I could give you the names, and it happens that I'm still working with them on a CNRS. CNRS is a national institution in France in charge of research, still existing, and we are working on information related with rare events, and in that case we are working with geophysicists because for them of course the issue is very important. But you see, once again, my geophysicist colleagues in that case tried to find a solution considering the limitations the law Gutenberg-Richter law meets, and they tried to find a solution with what they name the super cycle model. And the idea behind, very rapidly said, is that the problem should come from the time lapse considered. You see, for geophysicists, the scale and the time is not similar at the time and the scale we used to take under consideration as social scientists. Therefore, for them, the situation found in Esmeraldas could be a false problem. Consider the fact that should we take long duration under consideration, having 5 earthquakes during a century is not so big a frequency. I don't know if I'm speaking clearly about it, but should you consider the situation from a longer time of time lapse, then the 5 frequencies should be 1 frequency. You see, so they tried to shift the way they could consider and quantify the problem, because geophysicists try to quantify, of course, and they tried to find a solution while reconsidering the way frequencies are being numbered. You see, so this is why I offer our Mexican colleague to well, contact them and to exchange ideas with them on this. On my part, I find this problem very, very challenging and very interesting. Once again, geophysicists are not working at the same scale as we are working, and at the same time lapse as we used to work. For example, historians don't work with the same time lapse, even though the Anthropocene, as you know, induce us to reconsider the discrepancies between the scales and times considered.
Thank you, Dr. Pigeon and Dr. Chargoy. Carlos Lopez has two questions. If there are no written historical information about those kind of events, why not improve modern techniques of historical research? Would geological history helps to understand the future behavior of the floods and earthquakes?
Yeah, it's an excellent consideration. Thank you very much for this. I totally agree with this because, of course, history is a metropolitan way of considering time. And of course, it's nothing but one way of considering how the past has been dealt with. But there is place for other ways of having access to other informations, even though, of course, I know that those methods already exist. But you see, the problem may also come from the limitations historical research is bound to meet because the methods do not fit the local situation we have in Esmeraldas. In fact, this is the main part of the problem we experience, and the same with us, geographers or geophysicists, because we work from a metropolitan point of view. And of course, local population and even the mayor, the present mayor of Esmeraldas, consider that is opposing decisions coming from Quito, you see. So it's a very strange situation because at the very same time, it tells at all time, we're working with Quito. We would like to be more helped with Quito, but don't worry. We do not want to have too much help from Quito, and this help should not induce to control us too much. You see, so it's a very strange situation, some psychotic situation we have here. You see, schizophrenic situation. But I totally agree on the fact that there is place for other methods, even though I feel certain that they already exist. Anthropologists are working on this for sure.
Thank you, Carlos and Dr. Pigeon. And we have another comment, I think is the last one, is Dr. Margarita Gallegos says, merci beaucoup, excellent conference.
Merci. Muchas gracias. Disculpe por lo español, es terrible que de escuchar. This is why I do not try to speak too much because lo entiendo, pero lo hablo muy mal.
Thank you. And we greatly appreciate your interesting and valuable presentation. Thank you so much for sharing us your knowledge, Dr. Patrick, and thanks to Dr. Joel for the contact. Thanks for your assistance too.
But I have to thank you very much as well for your patience because I have to speak in Glabish, which is very unfriendly. I'm very sorry for that. It's a big problem for me, but I do not dare to try. Of course, I could have translated the presentation, but having the idea to read the presentation is very unpleasant. And by experience, when you try to read something, it's not the same result, the same outcome. So the Glabish is a solution that I don't like too much, but it exists and I try to do my best with it. But thank you so much for your patience, and especially for the accent I have in English because I'm French. My English colleagues always say, Patrick, you have an accent, a terrible French accent, but very fortunately, we can understand what you say. So, but they are terrible with us, as Gringolandia is terrible with Mexico.
Thank you, and please keep in touch with us. Have a good night.
It will be a pleasure, and thank you so much to Joël and all of you. It's always a pleasure to share ideas with you and with Mexican colleagues. So I hope there will be other opportunities, and take care of you, all of you.
Sí, muchas gracias,
muchas gracias.
por participar. No todos trabajan aquí, los alumnos son todos alumnos de la Escuela de Arquitectura, No todos trabajan en la cuestión de desastre, no todos, pero trabajan en varios campos, algunos de restauración, otros cuestiones más técnicas, otros más sociales, etcétera, ¿no?
También nos
Pero,
acompañan los de urbanismo.
y de urbanismo.
Bien.
Bueno, los de urbanismo, normalmente hacemos el seminario separado, los de urbanismo. Normalmente son los de arquitectura, ¿no? Para que veas, que son...
Hoy estaban invitados.
Sí, sí, están invitados. Los demás, tú ves que de los alumnos que tenés allá, es un poco diferente como planta de
¿Cómo
alumnos.
está con Edith Montesinos? Edith.
Sí, también está con nosotros. Sí,
Mm.
sí, sí.
Pues muchas gracias. Muchas
Bueno,
gracias.
muchas gracias por
Oh,
tu
ben,
participación.
con mucho gusto, fue un placer de hablar con usted. Mm.
Gracias. Buenas noches.
Gracias.
Buen día por acá.
Oui, Margarita
Gracias.
Gallegos. Oui. Mi también. Mais, au revoir, Margarita Gallegos, et merci de vos remarques.
Au
J'aurais
revoir,
préféré
merci
aussi-
beaucoup.
J'aurais aussi préféré, évidemment, en français, mais le français, contrairement à l'espagnol, n'est plus tant une langue internationale, contrairement à ce qu'elle fut. Donc, vous êtes une langue ascendante, nous, on est une langue descendante.
Oui, je comprends, mais je ne sais anglais et pour moi, c'est plus difficile.
De toute façon, toutes les langues sont difficiles, hein. D'ailleurs, vous voyez, le français est supposé proche de l'espagnol, mais pourtant, pour moi qui suis français et qui pourtant aime l'espagnol, même si je ne l'ai jamais étudié, hein, je n'ai jamais étudié l'espagnol ni au lycée, ni évidemment à l'université. Donc, pourtant, je m'entraîne au maximum. D'ailleurs, je vais essayer de vous faire rire un petit peu pour terminer. J'essaie de m'entraîner avec les telenovelas et la Reina del Sur. Mais bon... Le résultat n'est quand même pas non plus si extraordinaire. Ceci dit, je trouve que la Reina del Sur aide quand même pas mal. Mais bon, au niveau universitaire, c'est pas tant que ça.
Yeah. Merci beaucoup, c'est très, très intéressant. J'aime les Français, je n'ai pas étudié anglais.
Alors là,
Mais
c'est dur.
la conférence a été très, très claire.
Ben, je vous remercie. Il y avait le support aussi. C'est vrai que j'aurais pu essayer de le traduire, mais si je le traduis, ça va être bourré de fautes, ça va être horrible à lire. Donc, c'est pareil. I found the solution was not so much reliable. Donc, du coup, je n'ai pas traduit. Par contre, effectivement, j'ai eu le plaisir et la chance d'être invité aussi au Chili, en Bolivie, en Équateur, bien entendu, ainsi que dans d'autres pays. Et effectivement, dans ces cas-là, donc le support était en espagnol, donc ce qui peut aider aussi. Mais bon, qu'on le veuille ou pas, même si l'espagnol est la langue montante, et elle le sera de plus en plus, hein, il ne reste pas moins que l'anglais reste la langue de travail dominante dans le monde académique. On ne peut que le regretter, mais c'est comme ça, hein. Mais donc, l'espagnol, effectivement, moi, je dis toujours aux étudiants, hein, in France, I used to say to French students, please speak Spanish. Don't do like me. Spanish is the most important language you may have to work on. Of course, there is English, but Spanish is very important today. So, voilà, on en est là. Donc, effectivement, vous voyez, je n'ai aucune excuse. Et puis maintenant, j'espère qu'on va pouvoir revenir, refranchir qui s'achève, même si donc, la situation en Europe ne va pas être aussi facile que ça pour différentes raisons.
Je pense que c'est une opportunité parce que vous pouvez être ici sans le problème de les voyages.
Oui, bah le voyage est long aussi. J'ai 62 ans et c'est vrai que ça commence à être difficile. Surtout avec la Bolivie et le Chili, il est vrai. Mais le Mexique, c'est quand même un long voyage aussi, hein. Donc, voilà. It's a big and long journey, but it's worth doing it, of course. You have so much, so much attractive things to see, such as Paso de Cortes and so on, which are very, very important to see as a geographer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Muchas gracias.
Merci beaucoup.
Mais je vous en prie. Et puis, portez-vous bien aussi.
Bueno,
Bien, donc je vais vous quitter alors. Joël, tu veux qu'on discute encore un moment ou tu veux couper? Merci aussi à Olivia, Olivia pour le lien, donc, et à Milton Monterano, donc, pour les questions très intéressantes et puis la participation aussi.
Bon, si
Ainsi
tu veux,
qu'à tous les-
envoie-moi le link de ton système,
de-
de ton système de communication. Que ce n'est pas Zoom, c'est l'autre, comment ça s'appelle?
Ah oui, mais on l'a déjà utilisé, c'est Jitsi.
Si, mais je l'ai toujours, je pense. Jitsi, je l'ai.
Ah, tu veux que je passe sur Jitsi pour qu'on communique?
Si tu veux, oui, parce que là,
Oui,
c'est
oui,
plus
oui,
compliqué.
volontiers. Bien, donc merci beaucoup. Many thanks to everybody attending this presentation. I hope it has not been too much tiresome for the various reasons I mentioned before. And I thank you very warmly, and I hope to have the opportunity to work with you again. And this time on the spot, maybe, even though, well, it's a big journey and I'm rather tired now because I'm growing old. But there are older colleagues that travel to Mexico, so why not? And I hope the sanitary situation will improve even more, and this will make things easier as they are today. So, muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Et à bientôt.
Merci.
Joël, donc je me reconnecte par Jitsi. Au revoir.